I've clicked onto the Global Tropical Overview for March the 16th, 2024. As is always the case in these videos, the athletic expenditure in mind alone, and when making decisions ahead of any tropical cyclones, look to your local weather office, local emergency management, and local tropical cyclone warning center. We have two systems active across the tropics today. We've got tropical low 8 here, north of Western Australia, sitting there off the coast, and it's going to be sitting there over the course of the weekend and into early next week, and still could threaten the coastline of Western Australia as we go into early next week. But this will not be the first system we talk about. I'll leave a timestamp to this so you can skip ahead to it if you want to. But our main focus today is going to be tropical low 9 in the Gulf of Carpentaria, as this system is quickly becoming a potential significant storm here for the Northern Territories and Queensland. We're talking about potential for very significant rainfall totals that could exceed 400 millimeters in some places, and the storm could intensify potentially to a significant degree before landfall in a couple of days. Now, looking at the big picture, I want to stay on this large loop for just a moment as we just look at the storm in a large scale sense as the sun rises. You can see it's centered right about here in the northern Gulf of Carpentaria, but if you look surrounding it, we have this large feeder band coming right into the system and wrapping right up into it. And what I mean by feeder band is you can see there's just a lot of thunderstorms here wrapping basically right into the center of it. And this is just a large band of feeding moisture, feeding tropical moisture that is able to aid in the thunderstorm development around the storm. And eventually, this can allow the system, if in a favorable environment, to build its structure even more in the center. And you can get an eye to form eventually from this pattern. And we may see some indications from earlier microwave passes that this is somewhat underway. You can see this is from way earlier. This is from last night local time. But you can get the sense that we had some of this deep convection wrapping around and sort of curling around the low-level center, around like that. So if the centers are about here, it's starting to wrap around on the northern side. Now, unfortunately, we haven't had any further microwave passes since this one. We'll probably have one later tonight, local time, but the general idea is that the system looks to be trying to develop in a way that could favor some intensification, potentially of a significant degree, as it tracks south. Now, this is a close-up visible loop, and you can see once again the system looking pretty healthy with here's that large feeder band going right into the deep convection, which now the low center and the convection are now vertically stacked. And what I mean by that is yesterday, it was not the case. We had the low-level center exposed. There was no thunderstorms on top of it because we had some easterly shear impacting the system, blowing the thunderstorms off. That shear has since relaxed a little bit. It's still a bit present, but it's much less present today. And because of that, the thunderstorms are now able to sustain themselves on top of the low-level center. And that is a key feature that you need in a tropical cyclone for it to be able to develop further and potentially become a stronger storm. Now, one question you might ask is how much time does this storm have over the Gulf of Carpentaria? The Gulf of Carpentaria is known for, little spin-up storms that could potentially intensify fairly quickly, but most of these storms don't have a lot of time just because this is geographically not a large area for these storms to be around in. Unfortunately, for this case, the system will likely have at least a couple of days to intensify in. The steering pattern is not overly strong right now. You can see that the storm is not really moving too fast in this loop alone. And it's going to be slowly tracking towards the south over the coming days, and that will allow it ample time over the very warm waters of the Gulf of Carpentaria. And if it does manage to, like I talked about, build an eye within this center circulation, we could potentially see the system get its act together and potentially in a quick fashion. Now, overall, the environment is fairly favorable. Aside from the easterly shear that may still be impacting it this morning, the environment is primed really for intensification. It's not the most divergent pattern we've ever seen, but it's certainly not bad. We've got a low shear environment with a lot of upper level divergence. By that I mean all these cloud elements moving away from the storm and towards the east, and even some evidence of it moving away to the west. And this also shows you that there's not a lot of big features here shearing the system apart. There's not a big trough here over Australia that's just bringing a lot of shearing flow. And there's also not a very strong upper level ridge here to shear either. There is a developing upper ridge here over the Coral Sea, but this is fairly weak right now. And it's going to be, the storm is going to be moving in the direction of that upper level flow. So that shear is likely not going to be all too strong, maybe 10 to 15 knots, which a storm that's well developed can fend that off. Now, in terms of the steering pattern, the storm is being steered right now by a fairly weak steering image. Let me go to the beginning of this model run, and it's very hard to pick out just alone from this map, but there is a very weak area of high pressure outlined about like that across much of Australia. It's very weak, but it does have some influence on the system and is trying to pull it down towards the coastline here. And this will continue over the next couple of days. You can see this on the GFS, fairly slow movement. This is by Sunday afternoon, and the system is just now getting to the coastline. Now, something that models are still a little bit uncertain on is exactly when is the system going to make landfall and how slow will it be moving when it makes landfall. One of the difficult things is that this ridge alone that's steering it right now is already fairly weak, and the eastern edge is forecast to weaken and degrade pretty much fully over the next couple of days. So eventually you're going to have the ridge centered here more over Western Australia, which puts a little bit more southeasterly flow onto the storm, which sort of does the opposite of what it's doing right now, trying to pull it towards the coast. It's trying to push it away from the coast in this scenario. But we also have in the low levels a lot of westerly winds in this general vicinity south of the equator. And this is in turn trying to force the system more so into Australia. So you sort of have competing flows between that low level flow and that mid level ridge, and that just creates a fairly weak steering pattern. And this system really has not moved much. I mean, this is by a Monday afternoon, and you can see the system is just barely inland. In fact, on the European, it's even slower. This is by Tuesday morning. It's just barely inland. And this creates a multitude of problems. Mainly, one, it has more time over water to potentially intensify. But outside of intensity, this creates a large issue of potential rainfall totals across this region. This is a rainfall map from the European. And you can see that as the storm tracks south slowly, there's a large region of rainfall in excess of 200 millimeters, potentially in localized spots, 400 to 500 millimeters of rainfall. Now, something important that I should note here is don't take this forecast exactly as this is exactly what's going to happen. This is a little bit uncertain. There's still some uncertainty on exactly where the storm's going to track. Could it still come in here, maybe along the Northern Territories and Queensland border? Absolutely. And where that storm does track will shift this heaviest corridor of rainfall with it. But the general idea that I'm trying to paint here is that there's a significant threat here for very heavy rainfall on top of the potential for maybe some additional wind impacts from an intensifying storm. This is the Bureau of Meteorology forecast, and you can see that intensification depicted here in their forecast, forecasting a Category 2 here as it comes in, and this just a slow movement. I mean, it's the morning of the 16th and not forecasting landfall until the evening of the 18th. And could that be pushed back even more? Unfortunately, that is a possibility here. But we do have cyclone warnings and watches in place along the coastline of the Northern Territories and Queensland. And you can see in this forecast cone, anywhere within this, the center could track. So even here in Queensland, even though the center track right now is well to the west of you, it could still deviate your way, and you could still get some more significant impacts. Alongside that, down east of the landfall spot, there will likely be significant onshore push, which could lead to storm surge inundation along the immediate coastline, and especially maximized just east of the landfall point, especially if it gets stronger. Could we be looking at, Category 2, Category 3 here? It's absolutely possible with the environment that the system has. Now, something that could potentially help us here is I talked about how the system is going to be moving fairly slow when it comes up towards landfall. I talked about an upper ridge that is developing over the Coral Sea. This will be putting a little bit of northerly flow over the system, and if the system is just slow enough, it could put a little bit too much pressure on the storm to where it does start to suffer a little bit more, and perhaps we could get some weakening there along the coastline. However, it's important to remember that this system is already near the coastline by this point, and regardless of that, the significant impacts will likely be already onshore. And the unfortunate reality of this is if the shear is pushing the storms off towards the south, all of the thunderstorm activity and all the strongest winds are just going to be focused on the south side over land. So this is looking like a fairly significant impact here. And for those along the coastline here in the cyclone watch and warning, make sure you stay tuned to the Bureau of Meteorology. I'll leave a link to their website in the description so you can go ahead and get to the latest bulletins whenever they come out. There will likely be one later this morning. And I'll have more uploads on here over the course of the weekend and into early next week as the system does progress south. And I'll also have some posts on Twitter just to update you all on how the system is progressing as it does track south. That's not the only system we have around Australia this weekend. We've also got tropical low 8 here, still spinning offshore. We talked about this one at the beginning of the week, and it is still just barely moving. This system came southeast from the northwest and has since really just stalled here just north of the Western Australia coastline. In fact, I believe it is in about the same position that it was 24 hours ago. So really the steering patterns have really collapsed here. And this system is not going to move all too much here over the next few days. Now, the good news is over the past few days, we've seen a trend in the forecast, a good trend, that being of keeping the storm offshore. I meant to pull it up, but I can show you here the forecast envelope from the GFS ensembles, which is about 31 members. You can see here that the majority of the tracks are remaining offshore here, away from Western Australia, which is good news. However, something important to note along the Western Australia coastline is that this is not a guaranteed forecast. Right now, steering patterns are very weak. In fact, they've all about collapsed, and that's why the system is not moving too much. And in these weak steering patterns, I talked about this several days ago, very minor changes can make a big difference in terms of the track. I'll go through one scenario that I'm seeing right now that could potentially lead to a storm coming inland as we get into early next week. You can see that here's a storm as we get into Monday morning local time, still offshore of Western Australia. It really has not moved too much at all in this 48-hour forecast. But what you can see way down south, we've got this big trough digging into Western Australia. Now, this trough is forecast right now to stay fairly far south, and right now models are not really too keen on this picking up the storm and bringing it inland. However, this is still, potentially 3 days out, and this is a little bit of an uncertain pattern. A very small shift in this trough could mean the difference between the system remaining offshore or potentially coming inland. An example, if this trough does trend maybe a little bit stronger, maybe a little bit further north to where, say, the leading edge is about here, or maybe a little bit further south of there, that could allow a channel to the east to open up and allow the storm to come right into Western Australia. And that could allow the storm to make landfall along here. If not, it could allow the system to certainly get very close to the coastline. And you can see some of those ideas painted here in the GFS ensembles with some of these tracks now coming right along the coastline here. This is in contrast to yesterday where all of the members were showing an offshore track. We've seen some, not even just some, a good majority of them shift to maybe an idea of the system getting a little bit closer to Western Australia. And I think that's a key message today in Western Australia. Well, the good news is that the consensus is that the system will stay offshore. It's not guaranteed. And when steering patterns are weak, you just got to pay attention to these storms, especially during peak season. Now, some good news is that the system is not likely to get all too strong over the next few days. There will be some obstacles for it. You can see the Bureau of Meteorology forecast keeping it weak, not becoming a tropical cyclone until March the 19th, and even then staying fairly weak. Now, the upper low pattern will be fairly favorable. You can see that there is this large upper ridge draped over the region. But with the system not moving too much, there is some flow aloft. You can see there is some northerly flow from this ridge. And that could shear the system just a little bit and could potentially put some pressure onto it from intensifying. Alongside that, as we get towards the latter half of the forecast period, towards 5 days, the system will likely be dealing with a lot more dry air. We've had a lot of moisture across this region. We've had a lot of rising air over the region, but the large-scale pattern is going to be changing. And you can see that here in the GFS ensemble velocity potential map. And you can see this is the rising air that caused both tropical low 9 and 8 to form, moving off towards the east into the South Pacific. But we've got this large scale region of red here showing sinking dry air coming into the region. And this will just increase the presence of dry air around the system, and this could potentially be another obstacle for our storm. Now, the good news is if this trough does miss the storm, like I was showing on the 500 millibar pattern, once it quickly moves out of here, we are looking at models showing a lot of high pressure building back in across Western Australia. And most model solutions right now, in fact, I think all of them do show this carrying the system out west, harmlessly out to sea. So right now, the forecast right now does look a bit good for you all. But again, with this trough, a little bit of uncertainty on exactly how far north it's going to come. Still important to watch it as it does meander here off the coastline, as again, steering currents are weak. Anything could happen in this type of scenario. But that's all that I've got for today. I'll once again leave a link to the Bureau of Meteorology website in the description so you can go to their website and get the latest bulletins on both Tropical Low 9 and Tropical Low 8. I imagine this one will likely be getting a name later today. I'll just reload this just to make sure that it has not gotten a new advisory or a name. Doesn't look like it, but there will likely be another advisory later in the morning hours. And once it does get named, I'll try and get a post out on Twitter so you all know that happens. But I'll have more uploads over the course of the weekend into early next week. But busy time around Australia for tropical cyclones, so make sure you're preparing accordingly if you're ahead of either of these storms. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching.